Welcome to Bible Wisdom Today for those willing to think deeply. My name is Stan Watkins. Today, we return to one of the most famous stories in the Bible, the Tower of Babel, that building project that has become a permanent symbol for the self-sufficient human spirit. But before we arrive at the tower itself, we will first examine Genesis chapter 10, the so-called Table of Nations. At first glance, this looks like little more than a long list of difficult names. Many readers skip it entirely. But Genesis 10 is not filler. It is theology in the form of geography, genealogy, and history. The Table of Nations and the Tower of Babel are very different forms of literature, ethnography, and narrative, with different perspectives on the same story. One explains the spread of the nations. The other explains the division of the nations. One gives a map of humanity. The other explains the fracture within humanity. Together, they both show the unity and rebellion of mankind. But remember, these chapters are not merely about ancient people. They are about us. Babel is not just a city from the distant past. In fact, we are at risk of revisiting Babel every time we repeat the self-sufficient ambition of those ancient tower builders. Chapter 10 begins a new section of Genesis, and it begins like all the others. This is the account of, in this case, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The phrase after the flood immediately links us back to the end of the previous chapter, where we read, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. Humanity had survived judgment. God then renewed his blessing to Noah and commanded him once again to multiply and fill the earth. The author of Genesis echoes the same words at the conclusion of this chapter, like a bookend. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. The reference to spreading out anticipates the next story at Babel, where God encourages the people to spread out over the earth by confusing their language. The purpose of this chapter is not merely to preserve ancient ancestry records. It explains Israel's relationship to the surrounding nations. As Israel was preparing to enter the Promised Land, they needed to understand the peoples around them, their allies, their enemies, and their distant neighbors. The structure of this Table of Nations reflects that purpose. Most readers who come to this text assume that this is another boring genealogy and either skip it or skim it. A closer look, however, shows that it is not actually a genealogy, but an ancient ethnology. It describes the way the Israelites viewed their ancient neighbors. It is a theological world map. First come the sons of Japheth, Israel's more distant acquaintances. Then the sons of Ham, including the Egyptians, Canaanites, and Babylonians, Israel's major enemies. Finally, the sons of Shem, the family line of Israel and its most significant allies. All through Genesis, we see the same pattern. The non-elect line is dealt with first, before attention narrows to the chosen line. Cain before Seth, Ishmael before Isaac, Esau before Jacob. In this way, Genesis continually narrows the focus until finally all attention falls upon Abraham and his descendants. That is the pattern we see here as well. Several features should make us cautious about assuming that every name refers to a specific individual. First, unlike the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, no ages are given. Second, this chapter has a fondness for sevens. Japheth has 7 sons and 7 grandsons. Egypt has 7 sons. Noah has 70 descendants total. This was a traditional round number for a large number of people. We see that used in ancient Canaanite literature as well as other places in the Bible. Third, this list mixes personal names, tribal names, and geographic regions. In other words, it may use the terms son of or father of, but these terms often describe political or geographical relationships rather than direct biological descent. This table of nations also is not exhaustive. It focuses on the world known to ancient Israel, not sub-Saharan Africa, China, the Americas, or Australia. Still, the central theological point remains: all mankind belongs to one family. The author of Genesis first deals briefly with the descendants of Japheth, since Israel had relatively little interaction with them. Many of these names correspond to peoples around the Black Sea, Asia Minor, and the Mediterranean world. Javan refers to the Greeks. Madai refers to the Medes. Tubal and Meshech are associated with Anatolia. The Kittites were residents of Cyprus, and the Rodanites lived on the Isle of Rhodes. Verse 5 summarizes these people with three defining characteristics of nationhood. These peoples spread out into their territories by their clans, each with its own language. The nations appear to be dispersing across the land exactly as God intended. The next division, describing the children of Ham, is much longer because these nations had enormous influence on Israel's history. Babylon, Abraham's first home; Egypt, where the children of Israel became a nation oppressed by slavery; and Canaan, the ultimate goal of the Israelites' wandering. These were Israel's enemies and oppressors. In their later history, God's people would return again to Babylon as exiles. The narrative pauses especially over the founder of Babylon, Nimrod. The meaning of his name is not explained, but it could be translated, "we shall rebel," which certainly fits the spirit of Babel we will see in the next chapter. Nimrod is portrayed as the archetypal Mesopotamian ruler, a great military leader, an ambitious city builder, and powerful hunting prowess. By the time this report was written, his name had already become proverbial. He was Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. This does not mean that he was approved by God, simply that he was extraordinarily powerful and successful. The first centers of his kingdom, we are told, were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. Babylon, also known as Babel, was the most prestigious center in Mesopotamia. Its story went back at least to the 3rd millennium BC, and it became one of the great symbols in the Bible. Not merely a city, but the embodiment of organized human pride and centralized power in opposition to God. That spirit reaches its climax in the next story of a famous tower. The descendants of Canaan also receive special attention because Israel will soon confront them directly. The text even gives their geographic boundaries. These details seem superfluous here, but this is the first description of the land that the descendants of Abraham will later inherit. Some of the nations listed here as descendants of Ham would be described as Semitic by linguists and anthropologists based on language and genetics, but these are not the only classifications used in this table of nations. The primary criterion is the nation's relationship with Israel. The author has described the descendants of Japheth, Israel's distant acquaintances, and the descendants of Ham, Israel's enemies. He now turns to the descendants of Shem, Israel's family and allies. This section is the longest because it is the line leading toward Abraham, the ancestral patriarch of Israel. Along the way, we meet Aram, the ancestor of the Arameans, among whom Abraham and his father Terah lived on their migratory journey to Canaan. Later, Isaac received his wife there, and Jacob also lived there for 14 years as he labored for his 2 wives. We also meet Eber, who became the ancestor of the Hebrews. Hebrew is simply the non-Jewish form of Eber. One of his children was particularly important. His name was Peleg, which means division, because in his time the earth was divided. Already, the division of mankind at Babel is looming on the horizon. The primary purpose of the Table of Nations was to help the original Israelite readers understand their relationship with the surrounding nations. The Table of Nations represents the way the ancient Jews understood the directions on a map. While modern Westerners typically orient ourselves toward the north, Jews oriented themselves toward the east, the direction of the rising sun each morning. From this perspective, the south, being on the right, was more favored than the north, on the left. As they stood on the entrance of Canaan facing east, Israel's most important friends and allies were to the east and south. Their more distant acquaintances were north, and behind them were their enemies, the Canaanites and Egyptians. When Israel entered the Promised Land, they stood at the crossroads of the ancient world. God had a defined purpose for them. As he had said in Exodus 19, "Out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." God placed his people right in the center of the darkness so that they could bring his light. In the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, we see the multiplication of nations according to clans and territories. The next story, the Tower of Babel, recalls the multiplication of languages. Let's read that story, found in Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. The author sets the scene for the narrative to follow by saying, "Now the whole world had one language." In Hebrew, the same word for world or earth can also be translated as land. We should not assume, then, that the author meant that there was one language worldwide. The expression, "the whole land," could just as well imply a local event. The story begins with a group of nomadic people moving eastward. Their eastward journey may have had echoes of previous eastward journeys. Adam and Eve were sentenced to move eastward from Eden. Their son Cain also was condemned to move even further east into the land of Nod. In Genesis, an eastward journey is symbolic of alienation from God. Eventually, these travelers settled on the plain of Shinar in southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is the area now known as Iraq. Shinar is a geographical term that is not used in Mesopotamian documents, only in biblical and Western texts. It is an old term, originating before 1500 BC, and possibly derived from an archaic pronunciation of Sumer. Alternatively, it may have been the name of a Kassite tribe who moved into Babylonia. They had migrated into the region for over a century when a political vacuum occurred in 1595 BC. The Hittites sacked Babylon, allowing the Kassites to take control. They adopted Babylonian language, religion, and customs. They ruled until they finally fell to the Elamites in 1155 BC. However we identify them, the people described in Genesis seem happy to have discovered a good place to settle down. They decided to build a city and a tower. "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." This is the only reference to brickmaking in the Bible, except for the reference to the Hebrews making bricks in Egypt, despite the fact that it was a common practice in the ancient Near East. The Mesopotamian myth Enuma Elish describes molding bricks for a year to build the temple of Esagil at Babylon. This burned brick technology using bitumen for mortar was unique to Mesopotamia. The people's underlying purpose soon became clear. Let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. There are a number of ironic hints of their ultimate failure hidden here. Several key words contain the consonants N, B, and L, which make up the word Babel. In Akkadian, this word means gate of the gods, but it sounds similar to the Hebrew word balal, which means confusion, and also can suggest the word folly. The author emphasizes the irony of the name at the conclusion of his story. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. The tower described in Genesis is undoubtedly a ziggurat. Ziggurats were common throughout southern Mesopotamia. They looked like a stepped pyramid with a small shrine on top. They were brick structures filled with rubble, with no interior spaces. It was quite typical in ancient Near Eastern texts to describe a ziggurat with its head in the heavens. These were the most visible elements of the temple complex, but the true center was the adjoining temple at ground level. The main temple in the city of Babylon was called Esagil, the house with the raised head. The massive stepped ziggurat within the same complex was named Etemenanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. This was likely the historic model for the Genesis Tower. Both structures were dedicated to Marduk, the god of Babylon. Ancient worshippers hoped that their god would come down the grand stairway they had built for him and inhabit his image in the temple. When worship was complete, he could return to the shrine at the top of the ziggurat, which they had provided for his off-duty activities, like sleeping, eating, bathing, and anointing. It is important to point out that, contrary to popular imagination, these stepped pyramids were not created so that worshippers could go up to heaven, but so that the god could come down. The ancient inhabitants of Babylon wanted to make a name for themselves. Otherwise, they said, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This is precisely what they did not achieve. Ultimately, the Lord scattered them, and the name they gave to their construction project became the commemoration of their failure. From a human point of view, building a tower as high as the sky must have seemed audacious. The book of Genesis, however, considers it sacrilege, another human effort to reach God. The entire story pivots on Genesis 11:5. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The irony is devastating. The tower supposedly reached heaven, yet God must descend from heaven just to inspect it. That tower, which the builders imagined as the gate of the gods, was so puny that God had to come down to see it. The people's efforts were no comparison to the great God. God was concerned about the people's motives. There were several things that were decidedly in their favor. They were one people, with one language, with one desire to make a name for themselves. What they were missing was the approval of God. God said, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language." Notice the deliberate parody. The builders had said, "Come, let us build." God replied, "Come, let us confuse." Just like God instructed an angel to stand guard at the exit gate of the garden, he now invited the angels to assist in confusing human language. The result? The very thing that they feared. They were scattered over all the earth by God's judgment. Just like Adam and Eve, and later their son Cain, were all expelled from their home in judgment. Now the people of Babylon experienced their greatest fear. They had imagined that they were constructing the last word in human cultural achievement, but it became, instead, the ultimate symbol of human failure acting in defiance of the Creator. One of the most important questions of biblical interpretation that we must ask is, what did this story mean to the original readers? To answer this question, we need to know when it was written. It is difficult to determine conclusively when this story was written. Traditionally, the first 5 books of the Bible were thought to be written by Moses, and we often see important meaning of these stories to the people of Israel as they journeyed toward the Promised Land. Some portions, however, such as this story, seem to have been written at a later date. They were then added into what was already written. The closest application to the Israelite people would seem to be the generation who suffered exile into Babylon. There they would have seen the many great ziggurats dotting the plain between the 2 rivers, the chief among them in Babylon. This tower had fallen into disrepair and was being rebuilt during the Neo-Babylonian period by King Nebuchadnezzar. This was exactly the time when the Jewish people were exiled there. As subject peoples, they may even have served on the building crew, reprising their role as slave brickworkers in Egypt. If this was the historical background, what would this story have meant to them? First, this story was written to criticize their conquering enemies. It was written to ridicule the pretensions of the ruling empire, but masked as a story from earlier primeval times. This is the way subjugated people often criticize their rulers, indirectly, through parabolic stories. We see this when they describe the building materials for the tower. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. This is the narrator's implied disparagement. We Jews use stone. They only have brick. We use mortar. They only use tar. As for its great height, it was no skyscraper. In fact, God had to come down from heaven just to get a good look. They also crafted this story to criticize their conqueror's religion. The ziggurats and the associated temples served as a portal between the human and spiritual worlds. The ziggurats provided a way for the gods to come down to the temple to be worshipped. They were a stairway from heaven. The Israelites were familiar with this function of a ziggurat. It even featured in Jacob's dream of a stairway between earth and heaven. The offensive nature of the ancient religious understanding is sometimes called the Great Symbiosis. The gods had created humanity to meet their needs, which they did through religious ritual. In return, the gods met mankind's needs for provision and protection. This was a codependent relationship, totally contrary to biblical understanding. The Bible teaches that God has no needs. The temple of Marduk in Babylon was supposedly built by the gods using specially prepared bricks. Genesis attacks those beliefs. It was only a human building, only built with burnt bricks. According to the Sumerian tradition, Enmerkar and the Lord of Erata, there was a time when all people spoke the same language in unison, in praise to their god Enlil. Enki, the leader of the gods, changed their speech and brought contention into it. In contrast, Genesis presents the diversification of speech as a judgment of God, not a rivalry between gods. Throughout Scripture, Babylon is seen as the embodiment of human pride and godlessness. This must be judged by God. Isaiah must have had this story in mind when he said of the king of Babylon, "You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will sit on the mountain of assembly in the far north, that is, in the divine council. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit." Later, the book of Revelation pictures Babylon as a harlot, the incarnation of human pride and vice. Followers of God are told to come out of her and to rejoice at her coming destruction. Genesis is not subtle in its criticism. The story of Babel shows man's folly, not his wisdom. In addition to criticizing their enemies, and criticizing their enemies' religion, the story of the tower was also written to criticize human nature. On some level, the Israelites in exile must have realized that they had a basic similarity with those cocky tower builders. Here is where we find meaning for ourselves as well. None of us are much different from those ancient Babylonians. We are compelled to pull at the chain of our limitations. We feel obliged to overreach our boundaries. God divides us by incomprehensible languages and nationalism because we are dangerous to ourselves when we unite against God's purpose. This is not just an ancient story explaining the origin of world languages. It is also a warning to modern people. The Tower of Babel creates a picture of the independent spirit of mankind. In that sense, the city of Babel lives on. In fact, it is one of our favorite destinations. We revisit Babel whenever we exhibit that same prideful human spirit. Here are several ways we experience that today. First, we revisit Babel when we discard our God-centered identity. Whenever God is eliminated from the center, some other center is substituted to bind people together. In the story of the Tower of Babel, there is no reference to God as they undertook this great building project. In fact, they had had lots of practice living without reference to God. All the many generations detailed in the previous chapter lived without any reference to God. The psalmist refers to this independent spirit with these words: "Why do the nations conspire, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains," they say, "and throw off their fetters." The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. Our culture today is permeated with this brand of secular humanism. It is not that God doesn't exist. It is simply that God doesn't matter. We can ignore him. Human life and human achievement are the most important thing in the universe. We determine our own morals using reason and experience. We can determine our own purpose without reference to God. We can control our own destiny. We will take blame for our own mistakes and take credit for our own accomplishments. Most importantly, we can accomplish anything if we work together. That was the united spirit of those ancient builders, and God agreed with this assessment. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. A second way we find our way to Babel is this: we revisit Babel when we embrace our own self-sufficient ambition. We try to do our own thing in our own way. This is what we see from those ambitious city builders. Let us make a name for ourselves. In Scripture, God is the only one who makes a name for himself, and he is the only one who makes a name for others. God promised to make Abraham's name great. He also exalted David's name, but he did so that they could glorify him. When humans embrace self-sufficient ambition, they are trying to usurp the place of God. We all want to leave evidence that we have been here. A singer wants to have their song become a classic. An actor wants their film to define a genre. A politician wants a peace treaty named after him. A philanthropist establishes a foundation in their name. The rest of us just put up the biggest tombstone we can afford. God does not criticize ambition, but our ambition should be to make a name for God. We are not here to build arrogant towers to our own name, but to build the Church of Jesus Christ. This hints at the third way we still revisit Babel today. We revisit Babel when we abandon our God-given mission. Just after Noah and his children climbed off the ark, God reissued his mandate to multiply and fill the earth. The people of Babylon specifically rejected that command when they said, "Let us build ourselves a city, otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." They sensed the centrifugal force toward dispersion and entered this great united building project to counteract it. The real sin of Babel was not architecture, it was rebellion. The original inhabitants of Babel abandoned God's mission to fill the earth. Do we ever desert our God-given mission? After his resurrection, Jesus gave his disciples this commission: "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you." He also said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." The early church was true to their mission to disciple and teach, but initially they failed to spread beyond Jerusalem. But God saw to it that his mission was carried out. A great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. This was God's new dispersal plan. Too often, we avoid our mission as well. Our rebellion is not so blatant as the ancient Babylonians, but we can become so focused on our own spiritual growth and developing a nice, cozy fellowship that we leave undone what Christ has commanded us to do. When we abandon our God-given mission, we revisit Babel. The Bible ends the story of Babel beautifully with the story of Pentecost. There are several explicit common words between the two stories, such as tongues and confuse. There also is an extensive list of peoples at Pentecost, which recalls the table of nations in Genesis. There also are important contrasts between the stories. At Babel, languages divided humanity. At Pentecost, languages brought the people together. In Genesis, God scattered the nations. In Acts, God gathers the nations into his church. At Babel, God came down to confuse the languages. At Pentecost, he descended by his Spirit to indwell his people. At Babel, God came to inspect a human tower made of bricks. At Pentecost, God came to inhabit his spiritual temple, the church. The confusion of Babel begins to be reversed as people from every language hear the gospel and join to worship Christ together. The prophet Zephaniah had envisioned just such a time at the end times. "Then I will purify the lips of the people, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve him shoulder to shoulder." Luke evidently saw the experience of Pentecost as partial fulfillment of that day, when all worshipers would call on the Lord in one language. The human community that was disrupted in Genesis is re-established in Acts, when God brings the people of every nation and every language together, not to make a name for themselves, but to worship the one whose name is above every name. As we have studied Genesis 10 and 11 together today, we have been confronted with both the unity and rebellion of humanity. All mankind belongs to one family, and all mankind shares the same problem. We all repeatedly try to build our life apart from God. This spirit of Babel is still alive within the human spirit. We revisit Babel whenever we discard our God-centered identity, embrace our own self-sufficient ambition, or abandon our God-given mission. Thankfully, we do not have to keep repeating that trip to Babel. God has come to indwell us by his Holy Spirit and create a new nature within that redirects our ambition toward building a name for God. Then we never have to revisit those well-worn Babylonian streets again. This episode brings us to the end of the first main division of the book of Genesis, the primeval history. I have prepared a chart covering the major themes of these first chapters, which I've included on the podcast website, BibleWisdomToday.com. I have included a link to that resource in the description of this episode for your convenience. In our next episode, we will begin an entirely new section of Genesis when we meet Abraham, to whom God promised, "I will make your name great." Now, the basic architecture of God's salvation plan can really begin to take shape. If this episode has been helpful, one of the best ways you can support this podcast is by sharing it with your friends. Is there someone who would benefit from thinking through these ideas? Why not simply send them a link to this podcast website, BibleWisdomToday.com, and tell them why it mattered to you? That would be so valuable. Thank you for your help in growing this Bible Wisdom Today family.